I've only developed a desire to study suburbs in part because it's this prolific part of our metropolitan environment and something that urban scholars don't like to study. And so I think it just deserves our attention, especially as the majority of Black and Brown and immigrant communities and folks who are living in poverty actually live in these environments, and yet we pay them very little attention, or we tend to stereotype them.
Hi, this is Emily Holloway, and you're listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. You just heard from Willow Lung-Amam, author of The Right to Suburbia, Combating Gentrification on the Urban Edge, from University of California Press.
My name is Willow Lung-Amam, and I'm an associate professor of urban studies and planning at the University of Maryland. There, I serve as director of the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network. I also direct a project known as the Urban Equity Collaborative, and my research focuses on issues of urban inequality, especially in areas that are experiencing rapid demographic and economic changes, and broadly around issues of urban inequality, especially racial inequality and immigration.
Thanks for joining us today, Willow. I guess to get us started, could you talk a bit about why you decided to look at the Washington, D.C. area?
Yeah, so there's a couple reasons, I think. One, I am married to a native Washingtonian, have lived in, and been around the DC region for over 2 decades. And this is the place that I call home and very much deeply care about its history, its culture, and its future. So, as a community-based researcher and someone who likes to use research as a way to shape action on the ground and policy, I also prefer to write about places that I care about. And so DC was a natural one for me. It's also the place that I currently live, and I believe in contributing to your local community. Another reason is simply because I thought the story needed to be written. I wrote my first book on Silicon Valley, another region where I spent a lot of time. I went to undergrad at Stanford University and did my PhD at Berkeley. So I spent a few years writing the book Trespassers, Asian Americans in the Battle for Suburbia, that really focused on one Silicon Valley community that had experienced massive immigration, and wrote about some of the underlying politics of immigration as it played out in a series of battles over the reshaping of the built environment, over homes and schools and shopping malls and so forth. And that was a suburban community. So the thrust of that book was over how suburbs are changing. But the demographics of that book looked a lot different than what the DC area looks like. It was predominantly Asian American new immigrants that were arriving into Silicon Valley, predominantly upper middle or upper income immigrants moving into white communities. And when I came back to the DC region after having spent some time away, I thought that I really wanted to do a book about DC. I really wanted to focus on its suburbs, and I thought that there was a different story to be told than what we typically hear about in the DC area, which are the Central City narrative, the national capital narrative, and I think that erases a large majority of our region that lives outside of that, and don't have, and that I thought needed a focus. And then I think a third reason is because I'm a gentrification scholar and I read a lot of the gentrification literature, and it mostly focuses on central cities. And I think that it's important that we think about processes of neighborhood change as happening outside of central cities, and in many different types of places. And when they happen in different places, it's important that we not just know that it happens there, but we know why that's important. And so I wrote the book to center the question about why it's important that gentrification is not simply a center city problem, a problem or process.
I'm really glad you brought up that last point. There's a ton of literature on gentrification right now from a lot of different fields, but they also tend to share a fairly common narrative and geography. They look at cities and urban neighborhoods. But in your work, you're interested in the suburbs. How do suburbs challenge this? And really, what I'd like to get into a bit is the geography of the suburb itself. Is it actually distinct from the urban? Is it an extension of urban form and processes? Is it a historically specific phenomenon?
Yeah, I have long been a scholar of the suburbs, in part because I think it is this area that is not so discrete from the city, and I'm not even from the suburbs, so I've only developed a desire to study suburbs in part because it's just this prolific part of our metropolitan environment and something that urban scholars don't like to study. And so I think it just deserves our attention, especially as the majority of Black and Brown and immigrant communities and folks who are living in poverty actually live in these environments, and yet we pay them very little attention, or we tend to stereotype them in our politics and our policies. And I think they deserve the attention of our scholarship. That said, like, there isn't sometimes that much to distinguish a city from a suburb, except for sometimes a municipal line, sometimes the year that the housing was built. If it's built in the post-war era, we tend to think about it as a suburb, or after, we have certain lines that we draw around how year that the housing is built. We have certain lines that we often draw around density. We have certain lines that we draw in our urban imagination around, white picket fences and lawns. But the reality of that is that many of those things cross city and suburban lines. If we just look at the Washington, D.C. area, and I include a map of this in the book, if we just looked at it by housing density, there are areas of DC inside the DC line that appear to be suburban in terms of housing density, and areas that are outside the DC border that we would traditionally call a suburb that actually have densities that are quite urban. So these are really false lines between cities and suburbs that we often draw. But there are certain markers that we typically look at in terms of housing density, year built, and municipal status. So, I think when we're thinking about urban policy and we're thinking about practices, it behooves us to think outside of those lines that we often draw.
And so, with regards to gentrification as a process, we almost instinctively associate it with urban geographies. But how does the suburb unsettle or challenge these understandings?
So, not only the story of gentrification, but I think I saw it especially in the second chapter of the book, which is a background chapter, to really go back and say, not only do we have the tendency to think about contemporary gentrification through the lens of a center city narrative, but we've also sort of thought about, the history of displacement as being an urban phenomenon. But redlining can just take place in the city. Urban renewal didn't just take place in the city. Highway clearance of Black communities did not just take place in the city. Blockbusting didn't just take place in the city. These are phenomenon that have worked across our metropolitan area and really have followed Black and Brown communities wherever they have gone, and has sometimes pushed um, communities from the suburbs into concentrated poverty in the city, but has also, displaced suburban communities to other suburban communities. So I really try to sort of switch the lens through which we see many of these policies, because what we're calling contemporary gentrification today is not all that different from policies of the past that have serially dispossessed and displaced these communities and pushed them further into areas of disinvestment and neglect. And so I really try to reframe this way in which we're centering cities in sort of all of our understandings of various kinds of policies and practices, not dismissing the fact that they have historically predominantly affected urban neighborhoods, but also trying to understand that it hasn't been an exclusively policies that have been about central city neighborhoods.
Great, that's really helpful. So, moving into the book itself a little bit, you have 3 case studies in the DC suburbs. Can you talk a bit about how you landed on these places, how they fit into the overall argument you're making throughout the book?
So the book itself is a book about gentrifying suburbs. It's about suburban transformation and how suburbs that have undergone processes of massive redevelopment have experienced that redevelopment, who it has benefited, who it has hurt, and how communities that have borne the weight of that redevelopment have organized to fight back against some of those uneven costs of redevelopment. And so I profile in the book 3 communities that have undergone massive redevelopment in the DC suburbs. These are all Maryland communities. Um, and I talk about what the redevelopment process looked like, and how it felt on the ground, and what kind of impacts it had, particularly for affordable housing and small businesses, and then what the organizing looked like in terms of the grassroots groups that emerged to fight for a more equitable process of redevelopment in these 3 communities, and what changes were made or were not made that the community had asked for in each of the 3 cases. The communities are downtown Silver Spring in Montgomery County, Maryland, Wheaton, Maryland, which is also in Montgomery County, and the International Corridor, which kind of spans Montgomery County and Prince George's County, but I largely focus on the Langley Park side, which is in Prince George's County. And I focus on these 3 communities because I'm familiar with each of the 3 communities. I lived, worked, or still work in the 3 communities. There are also 3 communities that I call connected case studies, where the lessons from one case really did inform the organizing and the policy that went into future case studies. So they really did show what I hope to show in the book, which is a growing equitable development movement in the DC suburbs. And I think through the connections among the organizations and through the way that policy and tools were developed over the 3 case studies, get to see that quite clearly. So There are also three communities that were in different stages of redevelopment. Silver Spring was sort of an earlier case where redevelopment sort of kicked off in the 80s and 90s and has already gone through at least one major transformative period. Wheaton is a case of sort of where after downtown Silver Spring got finished, it became the next county priority for redevelopment. And saw sort of fits and starts of redevelopment. But what you see in Wheaton today is some of the results of that, those ongoing efforts. And then the International Corridor in Langley Park, in particular, is an ongoing fight over the future of that community. So these are all three communities in different stages of redevelopment where you can see the wins, the losses, what was tried, and how communities work at different stages to organize.
Right. So you just brought up the importance of these different community organizing efforts, these social movements in the suburbs that you study. Again, I think these are really commonly associated by scholars and the public with urban spaces. The urban is sort of presumed to have the right kind of geography for organizing due to the density, diversity, visibility, and so on. So, what do you think is unique about suburban social movements? What can we learn from them?
I started the first chapter by just raising our attention to the Black Lives Matter movement and that really started in Ferguson, or really, became an international movement in Ferguson, but actually started in Sanford, Florida, in a gated community um, before that. And so I think these are actually movements. Many of our social movements are not just urban in nature and aren't just sparked off or grow in urban environments, but are actually suburban in nature because some of those same inequalities, including police violence, take shape in suburbs too. And so, one, I just think it's important to bring attention to that basic fact, because even calling them like urban social movements suggests that they don't happen in suburbs. But I do think when talking about anti-displacement movements and how communities are organizing around a more equitable development platform, there are certain things that you need to pay attention to in suburbs. And one of the big ones is just capacity of organizing groups, nonprofit groups, folks that have the ability to outreach and engage diverse communities around um, a certain platform. And many of these organizations that led the fights in each of these three communities were very small, had very little capacity, were just growing their roots within these communities because these are not communities that have historically had a large immigrant Black and Brown community. So they're very diverse communities, and so organizing is very challenged to reach a community that is diverse and dispersed across a large area, and oftentimes without the same capacity that we have built up over decades in the central city. Many of the organizations that have worked in central cities have, been built over decades and battles that have spanned decades in central cities, and they've built relationships with communities through those battles, built trust and rapport, and the ability to do quick outreach to those communities. That is not the case in any of the three communities that I profiled. In downtown Silver Spring, Impact Silver Spring was not even an organization at the time that redevelopment began in downtown Silver Spring. It was simply one person that sat on a steering committee and said, we need more diverse voices in this redevelopment process, and there are communities that are being impacted that are not being heard. She started Impact Silver Spring to be able to get more voices on there. And this organization did make some strides in downtown Silver Spring, but I call it a case of a little bit of too little, too late, because this organization was really struggling to get its bearings in the community as it was organizing over things like affordable housing and small business protections. In the case of Wheaton, you had the Latino Economic Development that led the Fair Redevelopment Coalition. They were initially brought in by the county to provide technical assistance to small businesses and ended up organizing those businesses around a community benefits agreement and larger protections for those same small businesses that they feared were getting displaced by the redevelopment that the county was leading. But they had one person working in an office in Wheaton. They're a 50-year-old organization that has been organizing and working with small businesses in DC for, half a century. And they were able to start one satellite office with one person that really kicked off the fight in Wheaton. And in downtown in the International Corridor and in Langley Park, you happen to have a larger organization, Casa de Maryland, that led the growth of the Fair Development Coalition there. But they're an organization that was just getting started when the redevelopment over downtown Silver Spring was getting started. So they're only a few decades old and really have a large regional profile, not just a community focus in the Langley Park area. So there's all of these issues over capacity and capacity building for the nonprofits. There's all these issues over the way that tenants themselves organize and develop voice and agency. There's very few small business associations or tenants associations in many of these communities. And the political will and the political representation is often not there in suburbs. So the ability to get a cohesive voice, a cohesive platform built at the grassroots level, but then have somebody to appeal to at the grass tops level is really difficult. And so many of the folks that did pioneer some of the protections for small businesses, for affordable housing, for neighborhood improvements in these neighborhoods were kind of the first and the onlys on the city councils or the redevelopment agencies. And that kind of political will and that kind of representation for Black and Brown and immigrant communities is just growing in suburbs, but it's not as established as we have in many central cities.
What was the most unexpected or maybe surprising thing that you learned during your research?
I think it is probably just how hard communities had to fight for the small protections that were gained. Maybe that's not surprising to me as a scholar of urban inequality, but these were battles that lasted over decades in these communities and are still ongoing. I think that was another core lesson for me is just sort of thinking about redevelopment as an ongoing process. That's not a one-time, one and done deal, and the capacity of communities to be able to organize at the right times and be able to sustain that is something that is built over a very long period of time. And so, um, and what it takes for communities to organize and really trust each other in order to be able to work together to advocate for certain tools. It's a process. And so you can't just ask communities to one day stand up and say, this is what we want and this is how we want it. That capacity has to be invested in over time. And for communities that are for new immigrant communities, for communities that have not lived in places for a very long time, that have not built the institutional infrastructure. That's a really hard ask. So when we ask why communities don't just show up, um, there's good reason for that, and we should be investing in making sure that communities have what they need. But it's particularly difficult and challenging in suburban communities, simply because of the age of the communities, but also because of this dispersion of these communities and whether they even think about themselves as a community.
And finally, what do you hope readers will take away from this? What are the major interventions that you're working through here?
I really enjoyed writing the book. It was a chance to get to know places that I had lived in or worked in a closer way, but I've also seen that by writing intimately about communities that I know of and have worked in, that it has resonated a lot with communities across the nation that are facing similar challenges. And so I hope that it is a book that travels beyond the DC area and that really helps struggling communities to sort of see themselves and to see what is possible with additional capacity and investment and vision and organization on the part of communities. I hope that they take away some of their stereotypes about suburbs. I hope that they are surprised by some of the things that they see in terms of the resistance of communities and suburbs to some of these same phenomenon that we see in cities. I hope they are curious about what else happens in suburbs that they don't that they tend to think about as only happening in cities. And I hope that there's a good sense that a lot of investment is needed in order to keep these communities in place, and that the capacity that and the investments that need to be made are at all levels. That it's not just about the housing tools, and there are many housing tools, but there's a real need for small business tools. One of the reasons that I started the Small Business Anti-Displacement Network, which I lead today, is by sort of just understanding who is most harmed in these communities in which I was working and how very few tools that we have to actually support small businesses from being pushed aside, and how essential they are to the constitution of the community, to the identity, to the economy of these communities. But they are often those that are most impacted because we've really built our suburbs in, single-use districts. And so in order to retrofit them into the kind of dense, urban, mixed-use, walkable places that we supposedly value as urbanists today, that means you have to add housing onto existing areas of commercial districts. And so small businesses are going to be those that are most impacted. But I hope that it shows us that in many regards, these lines, kind of back to where we started from, these lines of city and suburb are often false, and we need to be following the processes of urban inequality wherever they land in communities, or I should say the processes of inequality wherever they land in communities, and not just presume that they land in certain places. And so those are some of the things that I hope readers take away.
My thanks to Willow Lung-Amam, author of The Right to Suburbia from University of California Press. You can find a link to the book in our show notes. You've been listening to UAR Remixed, a podcast by the journal Urban Affairs Review. Special thanks to Drexel University and the editors at UAR. Music is by Blue Dot Sessions. This show was mixed and produced by Aidan McLaughlin and written and produced by me, Emily Holloway. You can find us on Blue Sky at urbanaffairsreview.bluesky.social for updates on the journal and the show. Please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.